Look around you. So much of our modern world is new. New ideas, new buildings, new narratives. And that's great. Change is necessary for progress. The whole world gets it. So how is it possible that despite all this progress, we still learn in the exact same way our grandparents did? Our education is evolving so slowly. But why? What if your education could evolve and improve as quickly as the world around us does? What if your education was designed to help you discover who you really are? If students were created like co-creators instead of just products? If there was a space meant to build connections between teachers and students? A place where safe space doesn't mean you'll be shielded by censorship. Where liberty isn't just what you learn, but how. Your education should keep up with the rest of the world. And now, it can.
Welcome to the UFM Talk, the founding meeting of the Montpellier Society organized by the Graduate School of Universidad Francisco Marroquín. My name is Jesús María Alvarado Andrade, and I'm currently the director of the Graduate School at UFM. Before we begin, I would like to mention that the relationship between the MPS and the UFM is one of the various reasons which motivated this activity. Another reason is the lack of knowledge of the MPAs in the Spanish world or the Hispanic world. On this occasion, we have the pleasure of having as our guest a recognized and prestigious university professor who has dedicated his life to study and research in the field of economics and the history of economic thought, and of course, to the history of MPAs. His name is Bruce Caldwell. Bruce Caldwell is a research professor of economics and the director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University. He's the author of several books, such as Beyond Positivism, Economic Methodology in the 20th Century, editor of the collected works of Friedrich von Hayek, author of the Montpellier 1947 transcripts of the founding meeting of the Montpellier Society, published this year by Hoover Institution, and Hayek Challenge, an intellectual biography of Friedrich von Hayek. For the past 3 decades, his research has principally focused on the multifaceted writings of the Nobel Prize-winning economist and social theorist Friedrich von Hayek. He's currently working on a family-authorized biography of Hayek. The title of the book is Hayek Alive, in 1899 and 1950, published by University of Chicago Press. Professor Caldwell has held research fellowships of the University of New York, Cambridge University, the London School of Economics, and the Hoover Institution. He is a past president as well as a distinguished fellow of the History of Economic Society and past president of the Southern Economic Association and a life member of Clare Hall, Cambridge. He is currently the president-elect of the Society for the Development of the Austrian Economics. The structure of the UFM Talk consists of 3 parts. First, the presentation of the lecturer. Second, the lecture for about 40 or 50 minutes. And third, a brief round of questions and answers. Those who are watching the UFM Talk can ask questions through our social networks. We can follow us on social media networks on the Graduate School. Welcome, Professor Caldwell. The time is yours. On behalf of the Graduate School of the Universidad Francisco Marroquín, we thank you for accepting the invitation.
Well, Jesus, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I thought I would begin my talk by describing how I came to write the book that you mentioned, MPS 1947 transcripts of the founding meeting of the Montpellier Society. I had the great fortune and pleasure and honor of being a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution in 2019-2020. And I was there to finish up work on that first volume of the Hayek biography, Hayek: A Life, that's will be coming out in I think September or October of this year. And I was that first volume of the biography runs through 1950 when Hayek went to the University of Chicago. So the 1947 Montpellier Society meeting was part of that, telling that story of Hayek's life through 1950, telling in a chapter how he came to set up the meeting, what took place at the meeting, its importance in terms of the history of liberalism, etc. And in the process of doing research for that chapter, some of the Montpellier Society information is in Hayek's archives, which are at the Hoover Institution. But the Montpellier Society papers themselves are actually at the Hoover Institution. And I found things that I had not seen before, and I had not previously seen this transcript of the first meeting. And it struck me that this is something that that was a wonderful document in the history of liberalism that should be available to people, not just people who go to the Hoover Institution and work in the archives, but people more generally. And really, there was a number of motivations for doing this. First of all, the meeting was in 1947, so I recognized that 2022 would be the 75th anniversary of that meeting. So this is kind of a present to the Montpellier Society to commemorate 75 years of its existence. A second reason, though, is, as I said, was it seemed to me that, as we'll see when I discuss the people who attended the meeting, this was like a who's who of classical liberals in the 20th century. Hayek, Friedman, Frank Knight, George Stigler, just the list goes on and on. I'll mention some of the others that were attending the meeting. So it's a vital historical document that should be included amongst those that people who are interested in the history of liberalism would have available. A third reason, it must be said, is that the 1947 meeting and the Montpellier Society itself, particularly by critics today of neoliberalism, they often point to the 1947 meeting and they say, well, this is where it all got started. And they're critics of neoliberalism, so they portray the sorts of things that were discussed at these meetings, often in a very harsh and, in my view, inaccurate light. It was partially then in response to criticisms of liberalism and linking it to the Montpellier Society that I thought, well, look, when I read these transcripts, I don't see the sorts of things that these critics are claiming about liberalism being discussed. In fact, it was a lively sort of meeting, a lot of debate going on, a lot of disagreements. They were searching for philosophical foundations for liberalism that would work in the 20th century. And I thought it was a fairly noble goal and certainly something that had been misrepresented by the critics. So I thought that this would provide a certain remedy, or at least a counter argument to people who are claiming to portray what was going on at these meetings. The Montpellier Society is a closed society. You have to be invited to attend a meeting. So only people who were associated with liberalism had attended it. So people who were critics would say, well, this is a secret society. This is like a cabal that was up to no good. And why would they keep their meetings secret? So this is a way to shed light on the arguments that were actually being made at the meeting. And I think it will serve that purpose quite well. And finally, I also just wanted to celebrate the wonderful holdings of the Hoover Institution, who were my hosts during that academic year. So with that kind of background as to why I decided to put this book together, I then contacted the officers of the Montpellier Society. I said, is it all right to produce this book? They gave their permission. The book includes the transcripts from, I think there are 19 sessions. These were notes that were taken by Friedrich Hayek's secretary, Dorothy Salter Hahn. She was the wife of Frank Hahn, who was a Cambridge economist of some fame and importance. But at the time, she was a 21-year-old student who was just along on this famous meeting. She was the fly on the wall, as the saying goes. But she's writing down not an exact verbatim transcript, but trying to capture the sense of the meetings. And then, in addition, there were some papers that were presented by people like Hayek, by Aaron Director, by Walter Eugen, that were also included in the book. And finally, a wonderful picture album of the meeting was put together by one of the people who sponsored the meeting, Albert Hunold, a Swiss a man who helped raise the funds to arrange the meeting. So we have a selection of the photographs from Hayek's own album that was presented to him after the meeting was over. So let me tell you a little bit then about how the meeting came about. A little background on Hayek: he was an Austrian, born in 1899. Studied at the University of Vienna, fought in World War I prior to going to university. Took a trip to America, so he did get to see a little bit more than just Vienna. And in early 1930s, he first was a visiting professor and then later became a named chair at the London School of Economics. And so from the 1931 onwards, he was teaching at the London School of Economics along with Lionel Robbins. That was his best friend there. And when he first arrived, he got into a famous battle with John Maynard Keynes about their respective theories of the business cycle and of the importance of monetary theory. He later in the 30s also engaged in debates with market socialists and other socialists about, remember, this is the Great Depression. So people were saying that capitalism was dead. The intelligentsia, the British intelligentsia in the 1930s said, we don't want to follow the Russian example and become communists. We don't want to follow the fascist examples that we see in Spain or Italy or Germany. Socialism seems to be the middle way, and Hayek was critical of that. He invoked articles that have been published in German and other languages in his book, Collectivist Economic Planning. So the first few years that he's at the London School of Economics, he's engaged mostly in academic debates about the business cycle and what to do about it, and a very relevant question in the middle of the Great Depression, obviously, and whether socialism provided an alternative, which he provided arguments against. As the 30s went on, though, he became increasingly concerned less about strictly academic debates and more about the direction of the world, essentially, and certainly in Britain and its relationship to Europe, as it was clear that the world was heading towards war. And he was most concerned about that in the context of the future of liberalism. He was worried that liberalism had been so thoroughly discredited by the Great Depression. Everyone associated free markets with well, look what it gave us, 25% unemployment, deflation, massive political unrest due to the economic turmoil that was created by the massive unemployment. So people were just, virtually everyone had rejected liberalism except for Hayek and some of his friends at the London School of Economics and a few others. So he wanted to try to take steps that would help create not a new liberalism altogether, but take the best parts of what existed in liberalism and see if it could be tweaked so that it would be more relevant for the 20th century. One of the first steps that they did was there was a book by an American newspaperman named Walter Lippmann called The Good Society. Hayek read it, thought, boy, here's somebody who's a very good writer, very persuasive writer, who is advocating liberal principles. So they he helped to set up a colloquium, the Colloque Lippmann, that was run in Paris, in France, in late 1938. And it brought together liberals from one or two from America, Most of the rest were from Europe, and the vast majority, in fact, were from France. But it was to celebrate the translation into French of The Good Society, and Walter Lippmann himself came. So it was a conference, as it were, just like the Montpellier Society conference in 1947 that took place before the war. And at the end of the conference, it was all about, what is there a future for liberalism? If so, what do we need to do to help revitalize it and put it more in the public eye? And coming out of that was the idea of a center. So a center was formed in Paris. They discussed forming a journal. They wanted to have future meetings, and then World War II started the next year. So all of that was gone. Hayek was, as I said, at the London School of Economics during World War II. After the first year, the first part of World War II was often called the phony war because nothing much was happening. But then in April and May 1940, the German onslaught began. And over the summer, and then certainly into the fall, blitzkrieg and bombing, the Battle of London started to really heat up. So LSE was evacuated fully to Cambridge. And so that's where Hayek spent World War II. It was in Cambridge that he decided to write The Road to Serfdom. He had originally started a project in the 1930s that was going to be a typical Hayekian sort of project, a big 2-volume work that would look at the origins of what he called scientism in the 19th century, that starting with the École Polytechnique and ideas spreading to Germany and then to England and then to the United States, ideas that he thought were pernicious. Basically, the idea that we can reconfigure society, we can engineer society just like engineers build a bridge. And this linked with socialism led to lots of different movements in the 20th century that he thought were horrible. So it was going to be a grand work of the sort that German scholars often contemplate and some actually execute. He got through some of the early work on that, but once the war started, he realized that a big philosophical sort of work like that is not what we need. What we need is something that is going to be a refutation of some of these bad ideas that led to the current horrible situation of World War. So he switched from doing this big Abuse of Reason project, was the name of it, to doing the book that ended up coming out as The Road to Serfdom. It appeared in England in 1944 in March, and in September in the United States. So there's 2 different versions of it. And it probably would not have gained much attention at all, except that a small magazine, but a very popular magazine in the United States, is called the Reader's Digest. And one of the things that the Reader's Digest does is to collect articles from other magazines and put them together each month, and also does a condensation, a shortening of some famous book, whatever the most popular books are of the day. So a Reader's Digest condensation of The Road to Serfdom came out, about 20 pages long. And this is the way most people got acquainted with the ideas that Hayek expressed in the larger book. They didn't read the book, they read the Reader's Digest condensation. And this went out to 8.5, 9 million people. That's how broad of a circulation there was. So he had his 15 minutes of fame, as the saying goes, became quite a well-known figure, both in England and the United States, but also in the wider world. And this was just as World War II was ending. And indeed, one of the reasons that Hayek wrote the book was he was worried about the direction of policy once the war was over. So because of the fame from writing The Road to Serfdom, he got invited to give talks lots of different places. In the United States, he had a book tour on The Road to Serfdom. He gave talks in England a lot, but then after the war was over, he started to travel to Scandinavia. He gave 3 or 4 talks there. He was giving talks on the continent. A lot of places he couldn't go because, of course, we'll get to this after World War II. I mean, the European continent was in a mess. It was horrible. But he went to enough places that he started to meet people. And what he later recalled was, each place I went, there'd be some people who would be interested, and there'd be 1 or 2 academics who said, geez, this is what you're saying here is exactly right. What we need to do is to try to revitalize liberalism. You've offered these criticisms of socialism here, but and he would have discussions with people. So that idea that he had back in the 1930s that first got its spark at the colloque Lippmann started to reemerge again after World War II. And then he had a lucky coincidence on that book tour in the United States. He met a man named Harold Lunau, who had foundation money that he later was able to convince Lunau to provide funding for the Americans who would go to Europe to attend that first meeting. In addition, he met Albert Hunold, the person who provided the funds for the meeting itself in Switzerland. So this was a Swiss entrepreneur, banker, who had lots of connections. And between the funding that Hayek was able to raise in the United States and the initial contact for Hunold was Wilhelm Röpke, but Hayek also met him. They were able to put together the funding that would allow them to have the meeting. So Hayek sent out invitations to a lot of people, something like 65 people. Ultimately, 39 people attended, and that's how the meeting got set up. The funding and every other aspect of it was dicey all along the way. You read the letters back and forth between Hayek and the other principals, and you realize that this meeting could easily have not happened had just one or two things that could have gone wrong actually went wrong. But in the end, it did. It took place on April 1st through 10th, 1947. So just to give you an idea, this was an extremely fraught time. Though the war in Europe had ended in 1945, in the summer of 1945, a little earlier actually, in May, the situation had not improved in the almost 2 years since the war was over in Europe. The Central Europe had been devastated. The final year of the war, as everyone's converging on Berlin, it makes the violence that's taking place now in Ukraine look trivial compared to the massive destruction of cities, just city after city reduced to rubble from aerial bombing and then artillery as troops moved in. There was massive migration of people who were refugees. Anyone who was German speaking in the countries that Germany had taken over had to get the heck out of there as quick as they could, because the populations of those places would kill them otherwise. So mass movements of people. Starvation was looming in Germany in 1947. 1946 was a very bad harvest. It was a very rough winter, 46 to 47, and it looked like it was going to be another bad harvest in 1947. So the prospect of massive starvation in Germany was there. Germany and many of the countries in Central Europe were occupied. You had German occupation zone. You had British, American, French, and Russian occupation zones. There was no communication, very little communication across the zones because of zone control. The British and American zones finally joined together, but it was still basically a command economy, just as had been in place in World War II. There were price controls, there were shortages. It was horrible. It was basically continuing a command economy for 2 years after the war. The political situation was bad in a lot of different countries. There's strikes in the United States. Rationing was in effect in England until the early 1950s. The Communist Party was very strong in Italy and in France, and there was lots of strikes that were taking place there, strikes in the United States as well. There's civil war in Greece, and the foreign ministers of France, England, the United States, and Russia had met 2 or 3 times to try to figure out what to do, and the Russians were always intransigent. They just want to move. So they just kept the occupation going. And many people think that the idea was, well, we'll just wait until the Western powers get sick of this, and it's sick of trying to support the people who are living in Central Europe, and they get out, and then it'll be ours. So that was the situation in April 1947. It wasn't until June of 1947 that what was called the Marshall Plan was discussed publicly and finally voted on and ultimately put into effect, which helped start to turn around Europe. But they were meeting at the darkest hour. So just to set up the meeting. So who were the people that Hayek invited? Most of them were academics that he had met on these various trips. Certainly the people that he knew in England, like Lionel Robbins and a couple of others. There were some of his friends from Austria. So Ludwig von Mises, of course, was there. Fritz Machlup attended. A person that he knew through the colloque Lippmann was Michael Polanyi. So that was another great friend and someone who he helped bring to the London School of Economics. Karl Popper attended the meeting. From the United States, there was a number of scholars. Many of them were people who had left Europe at some point in the 1930s and ended up in the United States. But in addition, there were people that we would now today identify with the Chicago School of Economics. So this would be Frank Knight, Aaron Director, Milton Friedman. All 3 of them were at the University of Chicago. And George Stigler, who didn't go to Chicago until the 1950s, but he had trained at Chicago with the rest of them all under Knight. So they traveled together to the meetings. There were ordo-liberals. The most famous of them is Walter Eugen. Eugen actually spent the war. He was the only person to have spent the war in Germany during World War II. And at the very end of the war, he was being investigated by the Gestapo. He was lucky actually to have gotten through the war alive. But also Wilhelm Röpke, who had been at the Geneva School, the Institute for International Graduate Studies, that was run by William Rippard. So he and Röpke were at that meeting. And there was a host of others. There were representatives from Norway, Denmark, Sweden, France. So it was a lot of people that he had met on his various trips or had known previously. Now, in addition to the academics, there were also newspaper writers and other writers of various sorts. Someone who he knew from the United States was Henry Hazlitt, who had reviewed The Road to Serfdom for the New York Times Review. And this was a very important review, kind of started the enthusiasm for the book in the United States. John Davenport, who wrote for Forbes magazine, also attended. He had written a review of The Road to Serfdom. There was Max Eastman had been invited. He was the person who did the condensation, Reader's Digest condensation. But about a month before, he said, I'm not going to be able to make it. So they sent another Reader's Digest representative. The only woman who attended the meeting was a British editor of Time and Tide, which was a weekly magazine that was very prominent in England at the time. She also was someone who had written histories of various episodes in British history. And so she was a superb writer. And she was, as we'll see, someone who ran one of the sessions that were dedicated to history. Finally, in addition to the writers and academics, there were people who were part of foundations. So the Foundation for Economic Education, something that was very important for in the life of Manuel Ayau. My Spanish is horrible, so I'm sure I hatcheted that. But the people at the Foundation for Economic Education, that had just been established in 1946. So Leonard Read, who was the president of it, as well as a number of other people who were affiliated with it, attended the meeting. And then there was a very interesting fellow named Loren Red Miller. His position was at the Detroit Bureau of Government Research. This sounds like, Detroit is not a very big city. It's in the Midwest. Who is this guy? This person ends up being extremely important. He's the one who first made the introduction of Hayek to Luhnow, Harold Luhnow, the person who funded the American travelers, the travel over to the meeting. He helped Leonard Read purchase the mansion that was the place that the Foundation for Economic Education, that was the place that they had all of their meetings until really only about a decade ago. It was a marvelous mansion in upstate New York, up from New York City. He helped bring Ludwig von Mises and helped arrange financing for his stint at New York University, as well as the financing for Hayek's position at the University of Chicago from 1950 onwards on the Committee on Social Thought. So this is a person who was very quiet, behind the scenes sort of guy that was instrumental in putting people together, putting the right people together at the right time. He was just someone who was the behind the scenes person who helped manage all of these different things. So that gives you some of the personnel. One other person, I don't know if I mentioned Karl Popper. This is the person that Hayek brought to London School of Economics. He's in a very special category because he's a philosopher, basically a philosopher of science. But he's somebody who Hayek corresponded with when Hayek was at LSE and Popper was, strangely enough, in New Zealand, at a university in New Zealand, and wanted to come back to Europe. And as I said, Hayek helped make it possible for him to take a position at the London School of Economics at the end of the war. So what did they do at this meeting? For those who may have attended Montpellier Society meetings, they're wonderful meetings. And there's sessions that are academic sessions, and usually there's a trip somewhere in the middle, at least at the general meetings of the society. And on those trips, people who are both conference attendees, but also spouses, typically go on the excursions that take place. So they had that same sort of thing. They went to Le Capet, which was the house of Madame de Staël and Benjamin Constant, that was right on Lake Geneva. They took a longer excursion to a cathedral on Good Friday, or on the Saturday before Easter Sunday, rather, to listen to a concert and hear a mass. So they had some nice trips, but the gist of the meetings were devoted to 10 topics, and some of the topics got 2 sessions each. And the first week were topics that Hayek had proposed. And then the rest of the people at the meetings proposed the topics that were discussed on the second week. So what I'll do is just run through very quickly the 10 sessions, the topics that were discussed. And then I think it would be a good time for me to simply say, well, since this is a talk about liberalism, this was the place where the discussions about what does it mean, what does liberalism mean, and how should we think about it, really started to get fully discussed by a group of people who have become very, very important in terms of the later development of liberalism in the 20th century. So the first session was on the topic of free enterprise or competitive order. So he's juxtaposing there free enterprise and competitive order. Free enterprise is basically laissez-faire, and liberalism was accused of believing. Liberals were accused of believing in just very minimal government by its critics, and people like Hayek and the ordo liberals said, well, no, I mean there's functions for government that are important, and we want to figure out what principles we can use to decide which functions should be undertaken and which not. So we don't want to just say, as little government as possible. We want to articulate more clearly what sorts of government interventions we might view as reasonable and which not, and on what grounds. So that was the initial discussion, the most important discussion, being the first one. And at this, Hayek spoke. He read a paper, Free Enterprise and Competitive Order was the name of his paper. Aaron Director spoke along similar lines, and Walter Eugen spoke in German. Hayek translated, and we did a translation of the, we did a translation of Eugen's paper into English and put it into the book that I just edited. So that was the morning sessions. And then the evening session, they had a discussion about this. And the way you could almost describe this was Ludwig von Mises and some of the foundation people from FI against everybody else. Because basically, it was supposed to be free enterprise or the competitive order, but the only three speakers who gave papers were all talking about the virtues of the competitive order, and nobody was standing up for free enterprise, for laissez-faire. So people went back and forth, and Mises it was a prominent person in terms of the transcripts in the discussion. I am certain that this was the session at which he famously was said to have stood up at one point and walked out of the meeting saying, "You're all a bunch of damn socialists." But it's not in the transcript. But the reason I think it's clear that this was the meeting is that Lionel Robbins wrote a letter to his wife the next evening and said that this thing had occurred, and the second session was on historiography, so it wouldn't have happened at that session. So this was a very lively session, a lot of disagreement. Hayek, in the initial introduction of the meeting, said, "Look, we're not here to agree with each other. We're here to disagree, because what we're trying to do is iron out some of the ideas that some of them we're all going to be in disagreement about. Let's see if we can find some common ground, but the best way to do that is through the interaction and discussion of these ideas." The second meeting was the one that Veronica Wedgwood chaired. This was on history and the uses of history. And Hayek was quite upset by the bad uses of history, or the way that history was being portrayed by leftists and Marxists and communists and all variety of other sorts of historians. The views that were being expressed was, well, capitalism was horrible. The Industrial Revolution period was just a miserable time. The Marxist interpretation was ideas are not important. All that's important are the structure of production, relations of production. Ideas are just part of the superstructure, and they're just apologetics for things. Some of Hayek's LSE colleagues had offered up histories, like probably most famous would be Lasky, who had basically provided a Marxist interpretation of the last 250 years of British history, and basically saying, well, these liberals say that they're articulating universal rights of man, but really this is all just apologetics for property owners and capitalists. So there was lots of attempts to use history to discredit a market system, and so history was important, and he wanted to have a discussion. What should liberals do? Should we try to do scientific history that is neutral, or should we engage with values? And these are the sorts of questions that were discussed at that session. The third session was on the problem of Germany, and this was probably the most exciting session. Actually, it's two exciting sessions in the first week, maybe even three. But this one was about what do we do about Germany? As I said, the prospects were for massive starvation to be taking place that summer, and it was a controlled economy. And the two people who spoke were Wilhelm Röpke, who was a German who, as I said, had spent the war in Switzerland, and then Walter Eugen. And Eugen's presentation was viewed later by others at the meeting as one of the highlights, because he very calmly described how horrible it was to live under a controlled system where prices were controlled, where there were shortages of everything, where people, instead of going to work, they simply were engaged in a barter economy. He said, basically, our economy now is no better than it was in the 8th century in Germany, and with the prospects of things getting much worse as the year went on. And this really had the impact on the people who attended the meeting that this was, everything that they were talking about was really serious, that this was life-changing kind of discussions of principles that were important if the world, if Western civilization basically was to survive. So that was a hugely important session. The fourth session was, in retrospect, not so important. At the time, there was lots of discussion about European federation. So some things that happened later, you can point back to some of these discussions about federation. But at the time, things were just so fractured that it remained basically on a very theoretical level. A lot of the discussion revolved around, they just thought it would be impossible to imagine something like that in the current environment. Of course, much later, those sorts of things did come about. The final session was on Good Friday, and it was on Christianity and liberalism. And those two had, in a European context, often been viewed as oppositional, that there was criticisms of liberalism from the Catholic Church. Liberals in many countries were the opposition to church control of education. The contrast that was drawn by, of all people, Frank Knight. Frank Knight was the person who chaired the session, and he was famously agnostic, if not atheistic. So he was an antagonist towards Catholicism and religion in general, and said, people who are religious, they depend on faith. What scientists and what liberals depend on is trying to seek the truth. And if they come into conflict, that's all the worse for the truth. So that was his position. But others took other positions. And again, one of the most poignant speakers was Walter Eugen, who, having spent the war in Germany, said, look, under a totalitarian system, religious belief is squelched because you're supposed to have the belief in the system and not in some higher power. So he said only under a liberal regime can the practice of religious piety survive. So it was again just a wonderful set of discussions. So in the second week, there were a lot of economists at the meeting, and Hayek lamented that. He said, "Look, I tried to invite lots of people who would not be economists, but it was mostly economists who ended up coming." And he really had a vision of a society that would be far more widespread in terms of the backgrounds of the people who attended. But so 4 of the 5 sessions ended up being on economic issues. I think another reason is that first session, many people felt had not really gotten very far in terms of discussing specific economic questions that might be of importance in the post-war era. So the first one would be what we would today call macroeconomics, counter-cyclical full employment, monetary reform, counter-cyclical policy rather. These are the sorts of things that were being discussed. There was proposals that had been put forward in the 1930s, the University of Chicago, called the Chicago Plan, 100% reserve requirements. Reforming the banking system so it would be more stable was one of the things that was being propounded by some. Lionel Robbins, who had been very critical of Keynesian ideas, worked in the Treasury during World War II in England and came away much more sympathetic towards Keynesian ideas. He tried very hard to draw a distinction between Lord Beveridge of the Beveridge Report, who was saying, well, we could get to 3% unemployment, and Robbins wasn't buying that, but he did say, look, perhaps we could have counter-cyclical fiscal policy. If we're in a recession, that would be the right time for the government to undertake various sorts of expenditures in that regard. And of course, Milton Friedman said, yeah, getting the timing up on those sorts of things is pretty hard and could end up destabilizing things. So some of the debates that take place today were taking place even then in 1947, or at least precursors of the debates of today were taking place then. The second and third sessions were on wage policy and agricultural policy. And it was here in these two sessions, I think, that it most clearly became apparent the distinctions between people who were taking a purely economic approach, which was mostly represented by the Americans that we've associated with the Chicago School, and the Europeans who were quite sensitive to the various institutional arrangements that were on the ground in each different country. So you try to come up with a general proposal, which is what the Americans were often doing, and lots of exceptions were being offered for why that couldn't really work if we were in Switzerland, or couldn't really work in France, etc. And this is a true tension in terms of trying to find general principles, which is one of the things that Hayek was quite keen about doing. And people saying, well, you have to take into account that what sorts of institutions already exist on the ground. The people at George Mason University, I think, have done wonderful work in saying, yeah, you have to do a careful study of institutions as well as having economic theory in the background when you're talking about policy proposals. So very interesting sessions there. The fourth and final economics session was run by Milton Friedman. It was on taxation, poverty, and what to do about poverty and inequality. And it was at this meeting that he more or less proposed, he didn't call it the negative income tax, but this proposal that he later made famous, the idea that you have a progressive tax system, and below a certain level, people who would simply get money back. So you kind of a precursor to a universal basic income sort of proposal. And he was defending that, and a lot of people were critical of it. So there's a lot of lively discussion there. The final one is something that in our current time is rather timely, because it was called the current crisis, but it was really all about what do we do about the Soviet Union? They're stonewalling us, not doing anything in terms of these meetings. What kinds of negotiations should we try to have with them? Some people were saying, well, you have to try to negotiate in good faith. You have to believe that they are willing to negotiate and enter discussions with them. But other people, like Lionel Robbins, said at one point, he said, look, you're saying we should treat the Russians as rational human beings. And he says, I think often when you're dealing with the Russians, it's better not to assume that they're human beings, or it was a statement equivalent to that. So there was a lot of lively discussion about the current situation that the Allies were facing in terms of the standoff between the Soviet Union and France, Britain, and England. So those were the 10 topics that were discussed in the various sessions. In the course of this, they decided that they would form a society. They developed a statement of principles. They decided on a name for the society. When Montpellier Society was proposed, Karl Popper, the philosopher, said, "That's meaningless. What kind of name is the Montpellier Society?" But perhaps because it was so innocuous, it stuck. So that's the story of how the Montpellier Society came to be formed. And I think that's as far as I'd like to go at this point, because we do want to have time for questions and answers. And I've given you the full story about the formation of it, and we can look at the implications during the Q&A period. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion to follow.
Thank you, Professor Caldwell, for your dissertation. I have the book right there. I have some questions for you. For the people that are watching us live, you can submit your questions through social networks, social media. My first question, Professor, is are there any difference between the liberalism defended in 1947 and the one defended today? because you mentioned the different sessions, no?
Sure. So there certainly were lots of debates that were taking place. And I think one of the things that someone who read this book, who has knowledge of the Chicago School, for example, would see is that that they were much more prepared to be interventionist back in 1947 than they were even in the mid 1950s. The Chicago School view on things like antitrust started to develop more fully in the 1950s, but they were still, they were worried about monopolistic power, concentration, and steps that needed to be taken to constrain that. The ordoliberalism versus the kinds of views that Hayek was expressing, and then the views that were expressed by von Mises and the people at the Foundation for Economic Education. I think there are echoes of that in current debates among liberals about, to what extent should we have government intervention. There were no anarcho-capitalists there. That was a later development, and I don't know how widespread it was. Certainly, it was important in the United States. Continues to be important. There was the division between people who would be more economistic in their views versus those that were more interested in society as a whole. So Rupke, for example, defended interventions that would protect the family farm because he saw that as one of the finest examples of living in a civil society in which people, it was kind of a Republican view of a virtuous society in which you knew your neighbors and you respected the land and etc. So there were certainly tensions. I think there have been later developed tensions. I also think that there's been a better articulation of some of the principles that underlie a liberal state. Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, I think, was particularly important in that regard. And indeed, I should just finally say, coming out of this meeting, it's clear that one of his goals was not just to criticize socialist planning as he did in the Road to Serfdom, but also to articulate what the foundations of a liberal society would be. And I think that's what he attempted to do in that later book.
And what do you think about political, moral, or ideological disagreements that emerge at the end of the meeting, for example?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not everyone, for example, signed the statement, although 38 did. Maurice Allais, who was a French later Nobel Prize winner, did not sign it. Yeah. So there were differences there. I think one of the key moments, I think, was in the agriculture discussion when Loren Red Miller, the guy that I mentioned as being so important behind the scenes, said, look, you want to make this intervention for farmers because you think agriculture is important for feeding people and we're facing mass starvation, but it's also, as Rupke was arguing, such a fundamental aspect of society. And Red Miller said, well, look, you're having this intervention for this particular group. If you do it for this group, what about other groups? They're going to say, look, you've done it for farmers. Why can't we do it for people like us, steel workers? And he says, at one point, all of these interventions are going to be justified in one way or the other. What's the difference between that and a planned economy? Which I thought was a wonderful point. And indeed, Hayek supported him on that point. So there were real differences that were not just on economics, but certainly on much wider sets of issues. And people, one of the wonderful things about the sorts of people that he invited, there were too many economists, I think, but there were plenty of people to represent views that went beyond economics in terms of larger civil society and its structure.
Yeah, you mentioned the importance of Walter Eugen. Yes. He spent the war in Germany, no? But
yes, that's right.
Can it be said that the Montpellier society has had decisive influence on very specific issues through history? For example, the miracle of economic in Germany.
Sure. Yeah. So both in their description of how horrible things were in Germany, in the controlled economy that was Germany in 1947, both Eugen and Röpke talked about the reforms that they thought would be most important. And the two things that they identified, which was currency reform and getting rid of the price controls. These were the two things that Ludwig Erhard, who was a student of theirs or a friend of theirs, in fact, put into effect in 1948. They were doing the currency reform, and then he just announced, we're getting rid of the price controls, and that's what kicked off what's the so-called German miracle. So the very ideas that they were proposing at this meeting of mostly academics was in fact put into effect with great results, and really kick-started the new German economy that became kind of the powerhouse of Europe in a very short period of time.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of questions here. Okay. Can we say that the Montpellier Society is the most important group when we talk about modern liberalism? It's a person from social media.
Okay, so I don't know that would be the case. The Montpellier Society, even at the very beginning, Hayek said, "Look, there are two different possibilities," and Hayek was always arguing for one, but a number of people at that first meeting and at subsequent meetings argued for a second approach. Hayek's approach was, we want to investigate the philosophical foundations of liberalism and figure out ways to justify the various approaches that we take. And this is going to be a long-term process. This is not something that happens overnight. Whereas a number of others were saying, no, we should be getting out there and making policy proposals that reflect liberalism and trying to influence policymakers directly. And Hayek said, no, it's really a battle of ideas. And we have to get the ideas right before we start trying to make policy interventions. And I think this is something that Ayau understood directly. I mean, I watched a video of him this morning discussing his foundation of the work to found your university and what his goals were, and they sound exactly like Hayek's goals. That what you do is you try to educate people, and then those people educate others, and you go from there. So the direct impact, to answer that question, is not the Montpellier Society coming out with any kind of policy proposals about liberal principles, liberal policies, but rather to try to create the intellectual environment where the discussions about those policies can take place. And I think with full recognition that the policies will probably be different in the various types of countries that seek to embrace them, because of the institutional forms that are already in place before that takes place.
Yeah, a person asked a provocative question. What is were some of the topics discussed in the sessions ever tested?
So tell me what you mean by tested. Certainly, some of the proposals that were made there ended up being undertaken. But with a policy, you don't test a policy. You see whether the policy worked or not. I just talked about the German miracle. So certainly, getting rid of price controls and reforming a currency that is going through inflation is a way of, I guess, testing it. And some of the other proposals, the negative income tax is something that was used in the United States. It didn't take the exact form that Friedman described it. It's the earned income tax credit, so it's a specific type of policy. So some of these policies were undertaken. Some others were not. They just never went anywhere. The idea of 100% reserve requirement, basically separating the banking structure from investment structure, didn't take place. But so I don't know. I don't know if that's answering the question that you had in your mind when you asked tested, but Yeah,
Yeah,
someone,
it's a person from social media, but
okay,
yeah.
okay.
Another person asking, sorry, do you know what is the criteria to be invited to a Montpellier talk?
To a Montpellier Society meeting?
Yeah,
Okay, so I became a member in 2010. I had for a long time been working on Hayek and decided at some point I needed to understand the society that he formed better. And also I was interested in what were the meetings like. So what ended up happening the in the old days, the procedure was you needed to be invited by someone who was a member, and you had to attend as a guest 2 meetings. And then after you've attended 2 meetings, someone who was a member needed to propose you for membership, and then you would get letters of recommendation written by other members, and this would be submitted to the membership committee, who would decide yes or no. And I think over the years things have changed. In the early days, indeed, at the time that I was applying, they were quite stringent. If you didn't make it the first time through, that was it.
yeah,
And so it was a little tougher road then. Today, I think basically, as I said, what you need to do is have somebody who's a member who knows you to invite you, and then if you've gone to a couple of meetings and you think that you wanted to join, you would try to get one of those people to propose you and get some letters written. But
yeah.
that's the procedure.
Yeah, in your book, in the page 113, Professor Frank Knight said, economic history needs to be written by people who know more about economics than is common at the moment.
Right.
And he said, to make anything interesting to a large public, you have to put it in much more order than is really there in the facts. You have to use humanistic approach also, reviving theory of natural law. Natural law is very important, but with the revival of natural law, it is still perfectly possible to have a dynamic theory of natural law. You're professor of economic thought. You explained that? You could explain that?
I find Frank Knight to be one of the most fascinating economists, and it's because he knew so much. And the problem with this particular transcript, I think poor Dorothy Salter Hahn, who was having to summarize Frank
Yeah.
Knight talking about these things. If you've read any Knight, he wanders all over the place. So I'm sure she was imperfectly capturing whatever point he was trying to make. I have to say that particular his opening remarks for the liberalism and Christianity session, in my mind, are very hard to follow. They kind of wandered all over the place. So I'm not sure what point he was making.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. What's your take on it? Did you have some sort of idea behind it in terms of what you thought?
I don't know. It's very confusing now, but I think
Well, maybe we'll go back to that when we see each other in Oslo, and we'll
yeah.
parse it together.
I think it's right when he said economic history needs to be written by people who know more about economics. I think
Well, that part I certainly agree with.
I agree with that. But
Yes.
the
There's a lot
natural
of very bad
law,
history.
is very I have another question. You mentioned the importance of the about the discussion of interventionism, or the issue of economic interventionism is very important. What was discussed in relation to the role of government in the economy after the post-war period, being mostly promoters of laissez-faire approach, no? And then they're all classical liberals, because in the list is a very different approach, no?
Yeah. So I think I would not describe them all as classical liberals.
Yeah.
So if we think of I think had Keynes not died in 1946, that Hayek, who was quite close to Keynes, during World War II. They both were in Cambridge, and well, Keynes was working in London, but he would come up for weekends to Cambridge, and that's where Hayek was staying. They became quite close friends. They had dinner. They and their wives would have dinner together, and so, in my view, I think Hayek kind of saw Keynes as he's a liberal, not like me, a different sort of liberal, but compared to the socialists and compared to fascists, we're both trying to save a free market system. We have different ideas about the best way to do it, and they sometimes are dramatically different ways, but we have the same goal, and there was there's quite a bit of concern about what do you do about poverty, less about inequality. I mean, it's always important to distinguish. You can have unequal outcomes, but if you reduce poverty, that's the goal of most economists. And if you have some inequality in order to reduce that poverty, that's often the case. The most dynamic societies are the ones that are going to produce unequal incomes, but hopefully raise people out of poverty. And so, you would have disagreements about the details of the policies that might best accomplish that. But they're all trying to make society better. So I wouldn't call all of the people who are there classical liberals by any means. They're the guy who was one of the leading speakers in the agriculture discussion was proposing various interventions with interest rates that I think most classical liberals would find not appropriate. For example.
So one person asking is, do you think that the liberals of 1947 threw for a moment that we were going to get to a point where more government intervention was expected in exchange for giving our freedom? And said, quote unquote, I'm saying this for the current situation in the United States where people expect to be safe from terrorists if the government register everything that they do, search, talk, or even mention in a private conversation.
So there wasn't much discussion in the 1947 meeting of the issues that are being brought there, which is government surveillance of its own population in order to protect it, to keep it safe. But I'll tell you, one of the nice things about the history of the Montpellier Society. So I'm working on the second volume. I'm starting work on the second volume of the book. And so in the 1950s, the Montpellier Society continues to meet. And so there's lots of discussions about the Cold War and about development, because there was a lot of rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States trying to influence policies, as everyone in South America knows, in various parts of the world. And what are the best? What are liberal principles when you're also fighting a Cold War? These are interesting questions. And as the 50s became the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, discussions of whatever the contemporary issues were continued to be lively, discussed in a lively manner at the Montpellier Society meetings. And one of the meetings I went to in the last 4 or 5 years had to do with populism, and what should the liberal response be to the various varieties of populism that exist out there. So I mean, these are all the question that was a very lively, important one today. It wasn't being discussed in 1947, but it may well have been discussed at some later meetings when this first started to raise its head.
We have another question. What has stopped this set of ideas from going more out to the public, political parties, economic groups, etc.?
Liberalism has always had a very tough row to hoe. And I think I would recommend that reader have a look at Hayek's 1949 essay, The Intellectuals in Socialism, because he talks about, why is it that intellectuals, and he doesn't just mean academics there, he means thought leaders, ministers, people who are writing in newspapers, people who are making movies in Hollywood and elsewhere. They all are very attracted to socialist ideas or variants of socialism, and liberalism, not so much. So why is it? Why is it so hard to get the liberal message out there? And he offers various answers to that question, and says, yeah, we have to develop a set of liberal ideas that people can embrace and view it as something that is not just apology. Often liberals are accused of just being apologists for business, and it's not what they're doing. Indeed, you can go back to Adam Smith, a proto-liberal, and he was some of his harshest words were about the mercantilist policies of businessmen. So it's how to make society better in a way that it can also flourish economically, provide material wealth and individual liberty. All of those things together are things that should be desired. And one of the things he says is, socialism or the green movement, you can rally around a particular set of ideas that everyone apparently would agree on. We ought to have a cleaner environment, and you can rally behind that. Whereas liberalism is saying, we're trying to create an environment where people can have different views and pursue the things that are most important to them. Not where we all get behind one idea, but that we have a situation where lots of different people can have different ideas, and we can have exchanges about things, and we can learn things through that. So it is a different set of ideas that is harder to sell to people, as it were, because it's not selling a particular, here's what's wrong with the world, and here's how we're going to fix it. It's saying let's see if we can work together and be tolerant of each other. And tolerance is today it's a pretty hard thing to find, unfortunately.
Yeah, is one. I have a comment. I think one of in Spanish-speaking countries, the problem is that a lot of thinkers are very unknown people. I see the list, and I don't know about Professor Kingston, Professor Gideons, Professor Graham, Professor Dennison. I don't know.
Don't worry about that. Nobody knows those names. Nobody knows those names.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who attended that first meeting who, they're known in their own countries, perhaps, but even in England, I think people would. Dennison might be known. Robbins would certainly be known.
Yeah.
But Jukes, not unless you're a liberal in England, and there's not that many liberals in England.
Yeah. And Professor Caldwell, what lessons and challenges does the first session of the Montpellier Society left us today, 75 years later?
Well, I think it's the same challenges that they were facing then. I think that there are certain periods when liberalism is really under attack, and it's certainly, at least in the United States, there's always been an opposition between the left and liberals through time. Yeah. And in some countries, there was also the tension between the right, and particularly in countries where a Catholic tradition is quite important. Manuel Ayau talked about when he was first setting up UFM that there was criticism that was coming from the left universities, but also from the Jesuits, and that this was particularly opposed to liberal ideas. And he said that this actually ended up backfiring because it helped. Some of the people who were criticizing were people who were also not only on the board of trustees of the new university, but also in the government. So it kind of made it easier for the university to get formed. But those sorts of tensions are particularly true, becoming more evident and harsh in the United States. I ran a program discussing liberalism that's on the website of my center. You can find the future of liberalism, the future of conservatism, and the future of progressivism. 3 different panels, and I led the one on liberalism. And Steve Davies from the Institute of Economic Affairs in London was one of the speakers, and he said, "Look, I think the threat today to liberalism is actually more extreme on the right than it is on the left." which is quite a statement. But I mean, he's thinking about the illiberal democracies, people who are in Eastern Europe who are articulating those views, and also some of the anti-immigration views that are so strong in the United States, to some extent also in England. Just a closing off xenophobia that is horribly illiberal and is not embraced by regular liberals. But certainly are being embraced by people who used to be allies of used to be kind of, it's called fusionism, kind of the alliance between people who would be self-described as liberals and others as conservatives, and that seems to be fraying a bit, at least in the States. So
Professor, what role did Bertrand de Jouvenel play in the meeting?
Yeah, so he was a very interesting person. This was someone who had a very checkered and fascinating past. He had written a book called, the English translation was On Power. Mm-hmm. And I read this book as I was writing the chapter on the Montpellier Society. Fascinating book. And he just talked about how power grows naturally and is particularly, it was able to grow when we went from a society in Europe of kings to a society of states that were larger than the kings, and particularly when the states were able to start taxing people. That's when you really started to have mass army, the ability to raise armies of massive sizes. He says, Europeans of various nationalities have been fighting each other for 1,000 years, but it was always 1,000 people would die in this one or 5,000 in this one. So once you've got this mass mobilization possibility of power, and it's hidden because it seems to be a democracy, so it's power of the people, but really there are certain people who are making decisions, and it really has the ability to do some serious damage at that point. So it was a fascinating book. And Hayek, I think, met him only in 1946, but he is somebody who Rupke knew because Jouvenel was originally from France, and then had to flee France because the Gestapo stopped him, interrogated him, kept him under wraps for a while, let him go, and then he escaped. He just got out of there and lived in Switzerland, and that's where he got to know Rupke, because Rupke was also in Switzerland. He was one of the people, because he was living in Switzerland, who welcomed the delegates to the conference on the opening day, and he made some interventions during the course of it. One of his most interesting ones was at a meeting where they were discussing who might we nominate for future membership, and he said Carl Jung, the psychologist. and somebody else at the meeting immediately said no. So there's some entertaining moments in these sessions.
The philosophical statement at the UFM, Universidad Francisco Marroquín, speaks about the crisis of reason. And I have a question. What was discussed about the public education in the Montpellier society, and then the political crisis or crisis of reason during the meeting of the 1947? No.
Yeah. So I mean, the tension that I think the way that some of that discussion might have shown up in the 1947 meeting would be the tension between something I mentioned a little earlier, the ones who were more or less pure economists, like Friedman. At this point, Knight was very educated about everything. He knew everything, knew history, knew everything. But Friedman was very narrowly trained. He had trained as an economist. He worked in a statistical bureau during World War II, and he was basically taking a very economistic approach that does not take into account larger issues. And I think that tension has been in the Montpellier Society in later years. Friedman attended the 47 meeting, and then he didn't attend for 10 years because most of the meetings were in Europe, and he was at the University of Chicago, and if they're not paying your way, that's a long trip, an expensive trip to take. So he didn't attend for another 10 years, but then he became a more prominent figure in the meetings. And in later years, I think there was a tension between what might be viewed as the European branch with Hayek at its head, and perhaps Rupke for a while, but there was a break between Hayek and Rupke in the 60s. And then the Friedman Chicago School branch, which would be much more focused on specific policy recommendations as opposed to more philosophical questions. I did a paper on Hayek's visits to Chile with Leon Montes a few years back. And this Center for Economic Studies that was being proposed there was much more philosophical. They wanted to read the Constitution of Liberty and Law, Legislation, and Liberty, some of the things that looked at not just economics, but law, society, culture, all of them together. And some of the people who were on the ground at the initial meeting were more Chicago types who were, even at that founding meeting of the CES, were saying, what we need to do is talk about policy here. We don't need to talk about this philosophy stuff. So that tension is just it runs throughout the years of the society, and it's perhaps a fruitful one. I don't think it was a bad tension, but because it really does bring against each other really different perspectives and different sorts of ideas.
Yeah. Professor, thank you so much for accepting the graduate school's invitation. At the end of the year, we hope to have you with us in the graduate school or UFM for other activities, especially to celebrate the new biography of Hayek that you wrote. And to everyone that joined us this virtual conference, we want to thank you for your attendance and invite you to follow the graduate school networks and see all our programs and future activities. Thank you so much, Professor Caldwell, for your time and your kindness.
Jesús, it was my pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much.